Relative clauses, to me, are a fascinating feature within language. However, if you're like me, there's a likely chance that you never learned about them in school. So what are relative clauses? They are a clause or sentence that describes or modifies a noun, and there are two overarching types of relative clauses in English. The restrictive relative clause, the man who ate the fish slept all day, and the unrestricted relative clause, the mayor who I hate arrived late again today. In both examples, we can see that both who ate the fish and who I hate are inside of another sentence known as the matrix sentence. Despite both of these smaller sentences being relative clauses, they serve slightly different purposes within each sentence. In the first sentence, the relative clause serves to restrict or narrow the scope of the noun it describes, hence restrictive relative clause. The relative clause is integral to the overarching meaning of the sentence as it narrows down the person or object one is talking about. It's not just any man, it's the man who ate the fish. The second sentence has an unrestricted relative clause, a clause whose main purpose is to describe the noun, but isn't integral to understand the sentence. It just adds extra detail. So we now know what a relative clause is, but how do they work in English? Let's take a look at the first example. The man who ate the fish slept all day. Breaking this down, first is the noun being described. This noun, the man, is what is known as the antecedent, or the referent noun. Antecedent coming from the Latin ante, before, and sedere, to go, as the antecedent almost always precedes the relative clause within English. Next is the relative clause itself. The who in this relative clause isn't a question pronoun, as in who ate the fish, but instead marks the sentence as being a relative clause and is known as the relative pronoun. Who isn't the only type of relative pronoun within English. If we replace the man above with the dog or the table, you can see that the who morphs into which, reflecting an inhuman antecedent. Or in the sentence, I know the girl whose brother died, where the referent noun possesses another object. Aside from whose, both which and who can be replaced with the pronoun that. What's happening here is that each matrix plus relative clause combination basically starts as two separate sentences. In each sentence, there is a shared noun. This noun in the second sentence is replaced by the relevant relative pronoun before being placed in the matrix sentence. You can also see this in the second example sentence from earlier, but in this sentence we have a problem, as the second example has, the mayor, I hate who, is late again today. This just doesn't sound right, as in English we tend to front our relative pronoun, resulting in the more natural, the mayor who I hate is late again today. However, by fronting the relative pronoun, we end up creating a gap within the relative clause. This gap ends up telling us the role of the antecedent within the relative clause itself. Now these are the stereotypical examples of relative clauses within English. But what about in other languages aside from English? In French, for example, one can use qui for if the antecedent is the subject of the relative clause, or que if it's the object. This same dichotomy can be seen in formal English with who, whom, but isn't observed much in spoken English. Another option in French is laquelle, which agrees in gender and number with the antecedent, but not case. Unlike English or French, German doesn't load its question pronouns with the burden of also being its relative pronouns. Instead, German uses the definite article as its relative pronoun. Similarly to French, German also has its relative pronoun agree with its antecedent in gender and number. German also, like formal English who, whom, and French qui, que, marks the function of the antecedent on the relative pronoun itself, and not just by the gap it left behind. The only difference being that German has 4 cases to contend with, instead of the simple subject-object distinction found in English and French. Moving away from Europe, let us instead look at Arabic. Modern classical Arabic also employs a relative pronoun strategy similar to Europe, with different forms to agree in gender and number with its antecedent, with case effectively being ignored in the singular and plural. However, things change when the antecedent is in the dual, as the relative pronoun does inflect for case in the dual, but instead of marking the role of the antecedent in the embedded clause, like is usual in Europe, it agrees with the case of the antecedent in the matrix. Luckily for language learners, in colloquial Arabic, all relative pronouns have collapsed into the indeclinable ili. Another thing to know is that unlike European languages, where the role of the antecedent in the relative clause is defined by the gap it leaves, or by the case the relative pronoun takes, Arabic instead only uses gapping if the antecedent is the subject of the relative clause. If the antecedent isn't the subject of the relative clause, then the antecedent's role is indicated by a pronoun within the sentence, known as a resumptive pronoun. Through English, German, French, and Arabic, we have seen three ways of showing the role of the antecedent/head noun within the relative clause: the gapping method, the relative pronoun method, and the retained pronoun method. There is, however, a fourth type, the non-reduction type, where the head noun in the relative clause isn't reduced to a gap or pro form. This type uses a rather interesting strategy to mark the role of the antecedent in the relative sentence. It just takes the relative clause as a whole and replaces the shared noun entirely, effectively deleting the antecedent within the matrix. Most often, like in the Japanese example on screen, the relative clause is nominalized to better fit syntactically within the overarching sentence. This type of relative clause is known as internally headed, as the antecedent, the head noun of the relative clause, normally found outside said clause, is inside the clause instead. We now know all the ways the role of the antecedent or head noun is marked in the relative clause. However, one common thing among all the languages we've seen so far, aside from Japanese, is that they connect the relative clause to the head noun through the use of a relativizer or relative pronoun. But that isn't the only way to connect a relative clause to its antecedent. Another common method is to just place the relative clause next to the noun. This is optional in English, where the relative pronoun can be dropped, or the relative clause is in the infinitive, but it is mandatory in modern standard Arabic when the head noun is indefinite. Another way to connect the relative clause to its head noun is to treat the relative clause as if it's like an adjective. In English, this can happen with participle clauses, and it's also common in standard German, where the participle agrees in gender, number, and case of the head noun. In Japanese and Chinese, it's the way to form relative clauses. Now obviously, this isn't all there is about relative clauses. There's a lot more I could discuss, but the purpose of this video was just to give a brief introduction into how relative clauses work in English, as well as to how they work in other languages around the world.